Well, you heard earlier about the big revenue hole in government's accounts. By some estimates, the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has to either find another 15 billion rand or cut spending by a large amount. But as you know, a crying need for help from government. Depending on which number you look at, around 20%, maybe 25% of our children are growing up stunted. In other words, they're not getting enough food, which impacts the entire rest of their lives. Laurie Lake is at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town. Laurie, good afternoon to you. And we can all see the problems the Finance Minister is facing. We can all have sympathy for him. What kind of policies do you think we need to implement to help our children?
So, as you see, what we've seen over the last 2 years since the COVID pandemic is an increase in both food and fuel prices. Families across the country are feeling the pressure in their pockets. And at the same time, we've seen below inflation increases or food price inflation increases to the child support grant. So that's now only 2/3 of the value of the food poverty line. So we're seeing more and more children falling into food poverty, living in households where families simply don't have enough money to put food on the table, never mind meeting all the other needs that children may have. So we're concerned about the value of the child support grant, which provides essential poverty relief to about 13 million children. We're equally concerned about the cuts to the health and child protection budgets. We've seen existing austerity measures lead to the freezing of posts within health services in ways that are starting to impact on things like immunization, HIV care, nutrition, mental health services. And the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has issued very, very clear guidance to the state that the state should not be eroding or regressing children's socioeconomic rights. And if there is a need to roll back services, then children should be the very last to be affected. So we are calling for the prioritization of children's services in amidst all the budget cuts. And this includes health. It includes the subsidy to ECD centres, early childhood development centres. And it also includes the many NGOs that are providing child protection services across our country.
So, I mean, one of the things about this, and particularly with stunting, not giving children enough food, is that if we don't invest in our children, we're literally creating many longer-term problems. And I suppose, to put it another way, it makes good human sense to invest in children now. It also, this is very cold-blooded, makes good financial sense.
Absolutely. So there are three core arguments. The one is the science. It's absolutely clear that the early investments that we make in children in the first 1,000 days of life from conception until the time they turn 2, that's a critical window of opportunity in terms of brain development. We need to get the foundation right to build a strong foundation. So that's the science. Those investments are not only the most effective, they're the most cost effective. It's much easier to build a strong foundation than to try and fix the problems that evolve over time. And that includes not only deficits in terms of learning and education, but also a growing burden of non-communicable diseases that the healthcare service then needs to carry for years into the future. And last but not least are these very, very strong rights arguments that have been reiterated in the most recent set of concluding observations by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And we want to see government really upholding those rights, upholding its commitments to children that it has made in our Constitution.
So, Laurie, I accept everything you say, and I'm afraid, you know, there's a large group of people who all, in the hours before the budget, and this happens every year, saying we need to spend more money on this and that, and you represent children. I accept all of that. And logically and rationally, you are correct. But the money has to come from somewhere, and budgets are often about trade-offs. Do you have any suggestions of where that money could come from? And if you were to say, for example, it needs to come from social grants for adults, I think that would be problematic. I could see an argument, maybe it could come from the South African National Defence Force, but we probably need them in the DRC at the moment. So, again, where does the money come from?
I think one of the challenges, as you say, there's a lot of competing interests and competing positions, all jockeying in a sense for a slice of the pie. The challenge is that children aren't going to be voting in the elections around the corner. They didn't vote this government into power. They don't have a seat at the table. And that's the reason why government is held to a higher standard in terms of children's rights. For example, children's rights to basic health care is not qualified by progressive realization or the availability of resources in the way that adult rights to healthcare services are. And that's because government recognizes that it needs to step in to offer support when families cannot. So this is not just about children, it's about support, essential support to families who otherwise will be carrying the burden.
I wonder sometimes if, we spend a fortune, a very large amount of money on education, and at the same time we ask our education department to do things that very few countries ask their education departments to do. Our education department has to transport children long distances to work. More importantly than that, it has to provide food for children. Maybe the best intervention we can make is to get children to school at a younger age where the government can see them and we can make sure they get enough food. I don't know if that's possible.
I think if you're looking at things like severe acute malnutrition and stunting, you're wanting to see interventions kicking in the first, as I said, the first 2 years of life and during pregnancy. There's been calls for a maternal support grant to optimize nutrition in the last trimester of pregnancy, calls to ensure that infants are able to access the CSG as early as possible, because there's a huge gap in the system there. We need to be strengthening health and nutrition services in those first 2 years of life. And all of those things happen before a child walks through the door of a school. So early is a really important take-home message.
Thank you very much indeed, Laurie Lake from the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town. Do appreciate the time.